Hi and welcome back. I just spent the last year traveling full time, and today I'm going to break down how much the last year has cost me. The areas that I was in were more expensive places, so stick around to the end because you may be surprised at how much the entire year cost me. If you're new here, my name is Kyria and I've traveled to almost 60 countries, and in March of 2024 I retired early to travel the world full time. One thing I did a lot of before I retired early was to watch a lot of YouTube videos about how much things cost in different places. And so these videos are always helpful to me, so hopefully they will be helpful to you too. So let's get started. Before I talk about the costs, I just want to give a quick breakdown of what I did, because this really will change the amount that you spend depending on what you're doing. So let me go over that really quickly. After I first quit my job, I spent about 7 months bikepacking around the United States and Canada. So what this means basically is that I was traveling to a different place every day, so I didn't plan anything ahead of time. I didn't book anything ahead of time, and so that will be reflected in some of the costs, but also kind of to negate that a little bit, I did spend a lot of time camping, either wild camping or established camping. And I also stopped and visited friends along the way and did some house sitting. So that will all kind of go into the totals. And I'll break that down a little bit more as I go along. The accommodation portion of it is usually the biggest part. And so in my case, my accommodation was very varied. I didn't stay in any long-term things while I was bikepacking. It was all short-term, one day basically, rentals and motels and things. And so that definitely drives the cost of those kind of things up. After I finished my bikepacking trip, I started my slow travel journey by house sitting in Seattle. After that, I went home to visit my family. So basically for about 2 months, I was either house sitting or visiting friends and family. And so that also is reflected in the accommodation price. And then after that, I came to Europe, and I've been in Europe for the first 3 months of the year. And that has been mostly slow travel with a month at a time, with a few trips of a week or less kind of crammed into the gaps. So that's kind of how the whole thing was laid out. So I'll give you the totals, and then I'll explain a little bit kind of how that all breaks down. The first category is accommodation. For 1 year's worth of accommodation, I spent $11,892. which breaks out to roughly $991 per month. Now, if you're thinking that's kind of low, you would be right, but let me break down what that entailed. I ended up getting an Airbnb 88 days out of the 365, which is approximately 24% of the time. And then I ended up getting a motel or hotel for 77 days, which is basically 21% of the time. So those were my two highest, and probably the majority of the cost as well. After that, I stayed in established campgrounds for 35 nights, which is about 10% of the time. And that means usually I had to pay for those. And then I wild camped 41 nights, which is 11% of the time, which usually I didn't have to pay for. I also stayed with friends 56 nights, which didn't cost me anything in accommodation, but oftentimes I would pay for their meal. So that will be reflected more in the dining out cost than it is in the accommodation cost. I house sit for 57 nights, which is 16% of the total. And last but not least, I stayed with Warm Showers hosts 11 nights, which is 3%. And that basically is when people will host you if you're a cyclist and you can stay the night with them. So again, that doesn't cost anything either. The next category is dining out. For dining out, I spent $3,559, which is $297 per month. Like I said, a lot of this was because I paid for people's meals out instead of paying for accommodation. And the other big part of that was the bikepacking. So when I'm bikepacking, I have to eat, and a lot of times I don't have any options on where I eat. It's just wherever there is food. So a lot of times that food was not necessarily the cheapest. And also when you're on the road every single day, you don't really have time to cook and or room to carry a lot of groceries. So by moving faster, I couldn't cook dinners at home as much. And so I spent a lot more on dining out than groceries in that section of the trip. Also, of course, dinner and lunch were the two highest cost items, but while I was bikepacking, I did spend a lot of money on ice cream. The next category is entertainment, and I spent a total of $374 on that, which is $31 a month. I often will just walk around town or do things that are more free for entertainment, but I did go skiing while I was in France, and that cost almost $100. And I do like to do a walking tour when I get to a new city, so that's my second highest cost. And then the third highest one is museums. But this also included bike rentals, caves, tours, and the cost for one of my language meetup groups in Lyon. My next category is groceries, and I spent $2,899 on groceries, which comes out to $242 a month. Most of this just went for regular food from the grocery store, but I did have a pretty healthy baguette budget when I was in France and a pretty healthy snack budget when I was bikepacking. The next category is miscellaneous, which is kind of just where I put anything that I don't have really another place to put, and for that I spent $213, which is $18 a month. The bulk of this was shipping because I shipped a few things home when I was bicycling, and also I like to buy postcards and stamps and send those home to people, so most of that is shipping. And then the other things are like toilet fees and cash tips and things like that. The next category is transportation, and for that I spent $1,974, which is $165 a month. The biggest category for this is rideshare, and that's because I did a race from Canada to Mexico, and when you get to the Mexican border, there's basically no transportation whatsoever, or you would have to ride your bike back, and to get from the end of that to El Paso was $250. So that's the main part of transportation. The second highest one here is public transportation, which would be any trains or buses that I took that were more local. And then I also spent $600 on various trains either in the US, Canada, or Europe that were more long distance. The bulk of the amount for the trains was the US and Canada portion of my trip. I also ended up renting a car both in Germany and in Spain, and so these costs do reflect both car rentals plus the gas and parking for that. The last cost that's travel related is flights, and for flights I spent $468. This included 6 separate flights that I took in both the US and Canada, and then getting to Europe as well as within Europe. And you may be wondering why this is so low, and that's because I either used points or credit card credits for most of my flights. For example, when I flew back from Nova Scotia back to Seattle, I used a $250 credit that I had on my Capital One Venture, and then I used United points to fly from the US to Europe. So basically for the 6 flights, I paid less than $100 for each one on average. So that's basically everything that I spent for travel related things. And if you stop there, the total cost would be just under $21,000, which would be approximately $57 a day or $1,730 a month. And this would keep me under my budget, which is $2,500 a month. However, I'm gonna go over the rest of the things that I spent money on, because I think if you're traveling, you're not gonna have the same exact expenses, but you will have expenses for your regular everyday life that aren't necessarily related to travel. So let's talk about the first one, health insurance. I spent $2,700 on health insurance. Yours might not cost that much, and I actually just got a health insurance plan that's lower cost, but last year, or for the last year, my health insurance was approximately $225 a month. Like I said, I just switched over to Genki, which is only $75 a month, but these numbers will vary depending on your age, any pre-existing conditions, where you're gonna be traveling. And the reason I had a higher one is because I was going to be in the US. That's going to cost you a little more. So it really depends on your situation. So you'll need to take the baseline number and add any cost for healthcare onto that. The next cost that you will probably incur is, I call it utilities. This includes credit card fees, any subscriptions, any internet security like NordVPN. And for me, this also included, because I was on a biking trip, I had a GPS tracker so people could see where I was at any time. So I paid for that. That was another subscription. I also have a GoPro subscription. There's trusted house sitters. There's Microsoft 365. There's whatever cloud service you have. There's going to be apps that you might need for traveling. There's a lot of little things like that that are going to need to be included. For me, the total cost of all of those things was $2,299, which ends up being about $192 a month. The next thing, which is obviously going to be different for every person, I'm going to call it shopping. That's basically any other thing you have to spend money on in your regular life. So that may be clothes or shoes or any kind of gear, travel gear, whatnot. Electronics. Let's talk about electronics. So for the last 12 months, for the shopping category, I spent, wait for it, $5,181. I know. And listen, I don't even like shopping. I'm not a shopper. So really this category shouldn't be called shopping, but it's shopping. My computer and my phone both broke. So I had to get a new one of both. Also, I had to get extra storage so that I can save all these videos because, you know, they're very big. Plus I got cloud storage to do the same. So I have cloud storage and hard storage. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, right? There's all these little costs that you incur. I also, because I was cycling, I had to do bike maintenance and buy cycling gear. So let me just I'm going to give you a breakdown of the cost, because I think this is important, because these things do happen. And I think that this may not be exactly what happens to you, but you're going to need to have a little extra money saved aside for things like this. For camping and cycling gear, I spent about $1,000. For cycling maintenance, I spent $1,115. For clothing, and most of this included some merino wool stuff that I got secondhand, it was about $97. For electronics, I don't even want to say this, but I spent $2,800. I had to buy new running shoes, that was $44. And then toiletries, which mostly consists of sunscreen, cost $56. And last but not least, I'm including this just because I'm going full amount. I'm not taking anything out. You're going to hear everything that I'm spending, and that is gifts. So for gifts, I spent $574, which brings my grand total, drum roll please, up to $32,134. So as you know, my budget is $2,500, which would be about $30,000 a year. But kind of my premise for making that budget was the bike packing portion of my trip. I didn't really know exactly how much I was going to spend. I had an idea of kind of what I had spent before and what I thought I was going to spend. And so my bike packing trip was kind of my test subject for the first few months. And so it was because of that trip that I decided on the $2,500 amount, because for the bikepacking trip alone, I spent about $2,700 a month. And I thought, because I was fast traveling and buying smaller, more expensive quantities of food and not being able to store food or eat for several days in a row of the same food, that I would probably spend more bikepacking than I would slow traveling. And that's pretty much true, but let me kind of go over real quick the average per day, just so you can get an idea of what it would cost. And I'll go through this by category. For the US bikepacking part of my trip, I ended up spending about $64 a day. For the Canada bikepacking portion, it was $58 a day. For the house sitting portion, it was $22 a day. That kind of shows you how much you can save if you don't have to pay for accommodation. Germany was $92 a day, but that was only for 7 days. I was in France for 39 days, and that was $70 a day. I was in Krakow for 7 days, that was $78 a day. I was in Amsterdam for 5 days, that was $42 a day because I stayed with a friend. I was in Brussels for 2 days, and that was $108 a day. And the reason for that is, although I used points for my hotel, I bought meals for my friend who I stayed with in Amsterdam. So if you put the two of those together, it would be about $61 a day for the whole trip. I was in Spain for 28 days, and that cost $66 a day. However, once again, I had the categories of life, and those would cost me an additional $30 a day on top of everything else. The good thing is, my last computer lasted me 10 years, and I'm really hoping that this computer also lasts me 10 years. So technically, the $30 per day is spread out for 1 year right now, but it should hopefully be spread out for a lot longer than 1 year. However, it hurts a lot in the first year. So I went over budget for the first year. But as you can see, the slow travel, which would be Spain and France, were a little lower than the fast travel, which were Krakow and Brussels and things like that. So it really does save you a lot of money to travel a little bit slower. However, slow travel is not for everybody. You do stay in a place a longer time, which gives you a chance to get to know everything. But you are in a place for a long time. So if you're looking for more excitement, this may be a little too slow for you, depending. So now I've talked about all of my costs for the last year. So let me know in the comments, how much do you normally spend when you're traveling? And have you noticed a huge difference if you travel more slowly versus more fast? Thank you very much for watching, and happy travels.